Hello and welcome to Comedy in a Nutshell, a podcast where I talk to the people in comedy about comedy. You know, comedy has been a part of our lives ever since the very beginning, when a caveman first slipped on a banana peel, and all of their cave chums and other cave folk erupted in peals of laughter. Peels. That's probably where that comes from, although definitely not. I'm the comedy nerd who's seen more than 1,500 comedians perform live comedy, and you can find out more about my journey in comedy fandom on my website, thecomedynerd.com. If you like to hear what comedians have to say as much as I do, then please like, subscribe, rate, review and share the podcast. Thank you. My guest this episode is an award-winning comedian and writer whose 2024 Edinburgh Fringe debut talks about her coming out as a trans woman and all that entails, including going through puberty twice, which she herself says was too many. It's stand-up comedian Dee Allum. When do you feel was the earliest that comedy was an influence on you?
That's a good question. I suppose it's always been there in some capacity. I feel like I was always trying to be funny long before I knew why or could even really comprehend what was going on. I was trying to be funny. The first time that I remember doing it sort of on stage, which does feel like a kind of departure. I think most people are quite happy to just be funny around their friends, and that's kind of enough. But I think a lot of comedians have something slightly wrong with them that means they have to do it in a more, public setting. And when I was at primary school, I did a production, like the school play when I was in year 6 was Robin Hood, because the BBC series Robin Hood was a big deal at the time. Mm-hmm. So my class kind of voted for it, and I was the only person in my class who wanted to play the Sheriff of Nottingham. And I wanted to play the Sheriff of Nottingham because I thought it would be really funny if I, like the smallest kid in the class, was like the big villain that everyone was really afraid of. I thought that would be really funny. And then I played him really camp because I played him like a panto villain. And it was really funny, and I really enjoyed it. And I think that was the first time that I felt like maybe I can do this. The things I do with my friends, just the mucking around I can do with my friends, that can have some kind of real world applications, I guess. But obviously that is such a long way from, stand-up comedy or feeling like it can be a career, anything like that. But, it's always been there kind of, stewing away in the background. Yeah. So yeah, it's been a long time coming to get to this point, I think.
So, I mean, you said it yourself there. Most people are happy just to be funny with their mates. So was there some specific catalyst that made you sort of say, I want to do stand-up?
Not a single moment. I kept doing sort of little funny things on stage at school, and then at university I did quite a lot of sketch comedy, which is, we've all seen a bad university sketch show, and I was happy to add to that pile. And I don't know, I never really considered doing. I always, I was a bit of a, not a thespian, but I always wanted to be on stage. I just really enjoyed it, as I'm sure a lot of people do. But I was never really interested in anything that wasn't funny. I didn't really know why you would want to sit for 2 hours and either watch or be in something really serious with no humor in it. Like, what I enjoyed most about everything I ever saw was the humor. So that was all I was ever really kind of focused on in any way. And then I just sort of did more and more of it and got better at it, and kind of found my voice. I think coming out was quite a big part of that for me. So I'm transgender, so I was doing comedy for a long time and trying to find just anything that I thought was funny, but I wasn't really able or willing to be honest as a performer and sort of show myself on stage in any way. At least in part because I didn't really know what that would look like, but also because I didn't think I was kind of very interesting or had anything to really say. So since I've kind of figured that out, and I'm able to bring myself sort of more with me, if that makes sense. Like how every shitty HR lady says, oh, you've got to, bring your whole self to work, like that's what this is all about, bringing your whole self to work, whether it's pride or what have you. So I felt like I genuinely do feel like I've been able to do that more with comedy, which has kind of made all the difference in how I can kind of become a comedian rather than someone who just says funny things on stage every so often, if that makes sense. You know, like I have more of a persona.
Yeah.
I'm sort of a more complete performer in that way. None of this is to say that I'm sort of the finished article. I'm still raw in lots of ways, but it's a big sign of progress that I've noticed in the last few years, certainly.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting because I always ask my guests how much of them on stage is a character of them and how much is of their being uh, honest, if you like, about themselves. And it's interesting that you raised that there about being more of yourself, or what comedy has allowed you to do. Did comedy make it easier? Was that like the vessel by which you could be more yourself, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I have a slightly codependent relationship with my comedic persona, in that I started doing comedy about coming out in like a couple of weeks after I came out. So like, you know, and coming out as trans is slightly different to coming out as gay, in that it is sort of a full reinvention of your whole self. Um, or you know, often is, and that's certainly what it was for me. And it meant that I very quickly sort of the only forum I had to really think deeply about what I wanted to be, what I was going through, was on stage. So I feel like me and my comic persona sort of evolved at the same time and are very closely related to each other, which is quite weird and maybe not a good idea, sort of, as far as mental health is concerned. But it has happened that way, which is very interesting, I think, for people to come and watch. But as I say, maybe not the best idea for if you're just looking for a kind of settled psyche, because it is quite dependent on an audience, which should not be how your actual life is lived. But yeah, it's slightly strange, but I feel like comedy's allowed me to be a lot kind of freer, and I guess in a way less self-conscious about sort of my like physical appearance or the way I come across to people, because I know that if people are laughing when I'm on stage, then I'm kind of okay in my personal life. That does then mean that when they don't laugh, it feels quite personal in a way that an audience obviously doesn't intend it to be. So I think that's just the balance that I've struck at the moment, and we'll see how that pans out in the next 30 years.
How have you found it being a trans comedian? How have you found it? I don't know. Is it different to what other comedians may have said about what their comedy was like? I don't know who else to ask these kinds of questions, so I hope you'll forgive me in advance.
Yeah, it's interesting. Because you know, I did do comedy before coming out as well, and you know, I don't have sort of an exact one-to-one experience, both before and after coming out. Sure. But I do feel like it's harder in some ways and easier, I think, in others. So like the first gig I ever did after coming out, so I did the same gig twice, this same like shitty open mic gig, and so I did it once like a couple of weeks before coming out, and again a couple of weeks after. And after, it went a lot better. I was talking about things that were going on in my life. It was a lot more personal. People could kind of relate more, I think. But also the MC was the same guy both times, and he didn't realize that I had been there like the month before. And after doing it as a woman presenting female, after I was finished and had done a lot better than I had the previous time, he came up to me and started giving me lots of unsolicited advice about all the things that I could do better, which had never happened to me before. And it was literally the first gig since coming out and sort of having this new persona, both on and off stage. So it was really weird. People felt like they had kind of a right to give that advice. You know, I'm not averse to taking advice, generally speaking, but the fact that it literally never happened before, and then as soon as I had transitioned or started transitioning, suddenly people seem to feel like that door was open, was quite a revealing moment, I think. Just about how some people sort of treat, I guess, sexual and gender minorities. That they feel like they need obviously guidance. Like a straight white man, they obviously, even if I don't like it, I'm sure they know what they're doing. But these other people, they can definitely use my help. But also, you know, it has genuinely just given me something to talk about. You know, I think I just didn't have, as I say, kind of anything sort of personally interesting about me, or not that I could kind of see, or not that I really felt like I could get on board with. But now, you know, on the one hand, I do have to kind of explain myself every time I get on stage. Like people have to, I feel like I have to have people be aware of what they're looking at, because otherwise they don't have like a sort of solid base to then understand the point of view from which I view the world. But also like it's really funny. Like coming out is really funny. You know, having once been a man and now being a woman is a great kind of perspective to have, I think. And so it's given me a lot kind of comedically. But yeah, it's a balance. I mean, there's the yin and the yang with kind of all aspects of being trans, I think, and comedy is certainly no different.
Yeah. As well as people come up and offering you advice, do you get people coming up after your show and sort of saying thank you for talking about these things, perhaps?
Yeah, that does happen sometimes, which is really nice, and didn't happen before. No one ever came up to me and was like, thank you for finally giving a voice to straight white men. It's really appreciated. So that's nice, which makes a pleasant change of pace. Also, people tell me quite often that I'm so brave for doing this. I could never do that. I could never get up on stage and talk about myself. And well, firstly, people didn't really tend to say that before. And it's not like I don't think it's more brave for any particular person to do stand up necessarily. But it's like I feel like I suddenly in some ways I feel like I haven't really earned that praise to be like, wow, I could never do what you do. It's like, you know, you really could. It's not that hard. I think you just choose not to. So I suppose in a way I appreciate that most trans people are not stand-up comedians. Most trans people don't get up on stage and kind of air their every kind of tiny step and struggle to an audience. So you know, it is quite sort of, I'm quite emotionally naked in that way, which takes some bravery, I suppose. But it doesn't feel like bravery. It just feels kind of selfish. It feels like I'm chasing the laughs more than anything else, and it doesn't really matter sort of where I fit into that, as long as the audience is laughing. It's like it doesn't really, almost doesn't concern. So yeah, again, doesn't sound like a super healthy relationship with comedy that I've got, but I'm working it out. It'll be fine. I'm sure it'll work. It'll sort itself out.
I ventured an opinion recently, which I would be grateful if you would opine on, if you will. That the way that I see comedy has changed. So I've been watching live comedies now for like 45 years, I guess. And I was asked about how I thought comedy had changed in that time. And I said that comedy hasn't changed, I don't think. But what has changed is who and how of comedy. So the way we can perform comedy with technology is changing, and people could do reels and TikToks and what have you. And also who, because people now can use their voice and their perspective who previously were not able or weren't allowed to do comedy. People who are, you know, minority or marginalized or what have you. Do you think I was right to say that? Is that your perspective?
Well, I think both of those two things, like, I mean, the how and the who is definitely, I mean, that has just objectively changed quite significantly. So that's certainly correct. I think it can only be a good thing that, you know, that any kind of person has the same kind of opportunity to do comedy and to tell their side of the story. I think that's obviously great. I do also think the form has evolved. I think, you know, I mean, for me and a whole generation of comedians, we're now growing up where the sort of what in the 80s was the alternative crowd who was doing all these things that people previously never did in stand-up, all these kind of weird kind of left field bits or different sort of style presentation. To us, that's now just another option of many that are, you know, we're sort of standing on the shoulders of you know, existing comedy giants. So in a way, I feel like there's never been a better time to become a stand-up comedian, because there's so much stuff already out there that we can kind of draw on. We know the audiences will kind of be aware of, or feel like they're not kind of completely surprised by. So that kind of, you know, that plow furrowing that's been going on over the last 40 years definitely helps. And I'm sure in another 30 years, you know, the stuff that this current generation is able to do will then help the next generation push it even further. So it is constantly changing. I think you're right that the fundamentals do stay the same. I think, as far as I'm concerned, the only rule of stand-up comedy is that you have to be funny and people have to laugh. And if they laugh, then it's good. If they don't laugh, then it's not good. And I think sort of the different kind of levers that you can pull to make a human being laugh are fundamentally the same and will be the same. So in a way, that is kind of fixed, and I think is something that every comedian just tries to maybe approach in a different way, but they're all aiming for that same goal. So yeah, I think it's not as static, I think, as, I mean, you know, it's very clear that it's not static. Like every 10 years, I think stand-up comedy feels quite different. Certainly it already feels different now to when I was growing up. So yeah, it's exciting, but also I don't think it's ever so kind of, as long as people don't lose sight of what it's for, then I think it can always stay kind of, you know, just stay funny.
So you mentioned earlier on you did sketch Cambridge Footlights.
Yes.
And then I saw you last year doing your split with Katie Green.
Did you? You were one of the 8 people who came to that.
It was a great show. I really enjoyed it. My question is that you've gone from a comedy troupe and then into a split bill, and now you're forging ahead as a solo. Got your debut hour coming up this Fringe. How different is it for you performing comedy alone without the support of having someone sharing an hour with you, or the support of a group of other comics?
Yeah, it's definitely kind of, it stretches different muscles, I think. So like, as we're recording this, yesterday I did Chortle's Fast Fringe, which is like Square Theatre, where each comedian, you have, I think 29 comedians were on yesterday, and each comedian had 3 minutes. And in 3 minutes, you just have to get as many punchlines out as you physically can. And then before you know it, that's your time. I think I planned, of the 4 bits I planned to do, I had time to do 3 of them, and then my time was done. And that is sort of what it feels like to do, you know, anything like 20 minutes or shorter. It's like you constantly have to kind of justify kind of every second. Whereas I found moving to an hour it's a completely different sort of thing. You know, you're responsible for the whole kind of arc, the whole narrative of the show. Whereas when I was doing, you know, 5, 15, 30, it's like the audience knows that if they're not really loving it, there's going to be something for them in a minute, or like maybe they didn't like so much what they've just seen and they really like you, so they kind of give you more. But if it's just you for the whole hour, it just kind of lives and dies on what you're like. I mean, of course, I mean, what else could it be related to? And that's kind of a pressure that's quite different to anything that's not a solo show. I think also it's a different kind of comedy. You know, I feel like people may have gone to see someone maybe do 5 or 10 and really like them, and then they see their hour and they're like, oh, this isn't nearly as good. This doesn't work in the same way. I don't really understand why. And I think there's a bunch of reasons that can happen. I think sometimes it's impossible to keep up that kind of relentless pace that you might see in a really great 5 minutes. If you give that up for a whole hour, an audience is just gonna, I think, just emotionally check out a little bit. Like, you can't sustain that. you have to have ebb and flow. You have to have some slower moments. You have to have kind of variety. It's like writing a novel as opposed to a poem. It's like a whole book of verse is really boring, but like Dan Brown is very exciting. Individual sentences of Dan Brown are bad, but like the whole picture is exciting and enthralling. So it's a different kind of, it's a different style, it's a different skill, I think, to write a really good hour as opposed to a shorter set. And that's something that I've felt very keenly. I mean, this is my debut, as you say. It's my first kind of crack at it. I think it's good, but it's definitely a different muscles that I'm flexing, and hopefully I've done a good job.
Do you find yourself more comfortable with that hour? You're flexing those new muscles. Are you more happy with the longer form so you could tell a tale where you can unravel a story kind of thing?
Yeah, it's nice in lots of ways. It's kind of freeing in that I am able to just kind of, obviously take my time, just kind of do whatever I like. Obviously, callbacks and all these different sort of comedic devices that you can get a lot more out of over the course of an hour than you could in 5-10 minutes. It's just kind of there's more kind of dimensions that you have to keep in mind. You have to keep in mind obviously sort of the overall narrative of what you're saying. You have to keep in mind kind of the emotional beats you want to hit. You have to keep in mind, if you're setting up a callback, how early or far away do you want that callback to be? That's less important than the other things, but it really can make all the difference, I think, having a well-timed callback. It's just lots of things to bear in mind. And that's fun because you've got like a whole other set of tools to play with, and it's feels like a responsibility to use all of them to the best of your ability. And I mean, that's what art's all about, is making the most of every medium available, which sounds grand because it's, at the end of the day, it is just telling jokes, so let's not get carried away. But that is slightly how it feels as a self-centered egotistical comedian.
Do you think also, in terms of where you're happy, it's been said that comedians can be writers who are trying to be performers, or performers who are trying to write? Do you find yourself more a writer, or are you happier on the stage?
That's good. That's a good question. I think it's slightly a false dichotomy in that sort of any stand-up anywhere requires both performing and writing to be good. Like if you want to be a good stand-up comedian, I mean, there are some exceptions. I feel like sometimes, particularly as comedians get successful, the writing kind of falls off a cliff. But I think the performance rarely does. I think most comedians who sort of outgrow their own success, if that makes sense, they still retain like that kind of showmanship. But I think in order to be really good, you do have to have really sharply written stuff and perform it really well. So I think both, they're just sort of two necessary things to have if you want to do well. I think on the question of whether it's easier to just write it and then give it away to someone else to figure out how that whole thing works, or whether it's easier to have kind of full ownership of the whole creative process, I think I like performing a lot. I think that's sort of the thing that drives me. The thing that kind of motivates me is to go on stage and get a laugh out of a room full of actual people. I think in the things that I've written in the past, where I've written them and then they've been performed by other people, I've still enjoyed it, but it's not had quite the same sort of bite as an overall experience, which in some ways is very pleasant, because when you're on stage, every time still before I go on stage, I am really nervous, wherever I am, whatever I'm doing. And if this is something that I'm going to do for the next 30 years every day, I've got to figure out a way not to be made nervous by it anymore, because it's not a great way to live your life, it turns out. But I think that is the thing that makes it special to me, at least. So I'm going to continue to try and do it as long as my nerves will allow.
One of my previous guests said that they were given the advice that if they're not nervous before they go on, they should be nervous that they're not nervous.
Yeah, that's good advice. That is good advice. I think it keeps you honest, the nerves. They keep you, motivated to give a really good performance. Because, people can pay to see all sorts of things, and they've chosen to pay and see, I guess, you if it's a solo show, or, you and others if it's not. But either way, they're putting that trust and that faith in you. And I think it would be churlish not to, take that responsibility quite seriously, which, yeah, again, is a stressful way to live your life. Most jobs don't require you to be nervous every day, but this one does, and that's how it works. And I think overall, with everything else that it kind of gives me, I'll take that, I think.
What about your competitive nature? Do you have a competitive streak? Because I know that you've been in a number of competitions. You took 2 North Down New Act in 2021. You're a finalist at BBC 2022.
Yeah.
All these competitions. Do you have a competitive spirit? Do you want to compete, stand up against your peers, or are those nightmarish experiences?
Well, it's sort of both things are true at once. I think I am a bit competitive. I did enjoy doing well in competitions. I think it's just sort of an even further crystallization of that validation that you get when an audience laughs. It's like, okay, they laughed a lot, but then also a panel of people decided that you were the best. It's like that's that's always going to be a nice thing. I mean, it does help when they go well. When they don't go well, I think, comedy's not meant to be a competition. It sucks. Why would it? It doesn't need to be so competitive. So on the one hand, I have enjoyed the competitions. I do also think that in sort of the real comedy world, that's not quite how it works. There is very much space for lots and lots of different kinds of comedians, lots of different styles of comedy. It doesn't really make sense to consider it to be a competition. I think in the run up to this debut, the debut, like capital T, capital D, is, I think, quite a big, or seen as quite a big deal in the comedy world. Like feels like there's a lot of pressure to kind of compete with your peers and have the best one and get nominated for the awards and get, better reviews than your kind of cohort. And I don't know how productive that is. I don't think that really helps anyone make anything better. It just makes everyone stressed and kind of turns everyone into a bit of a loner who's envious of other people's successes, when really in the actual comedy world, once you move beyond that, there's really no need. Like there's audience enough for everyone to do well, at least if you make something good. So I think when you start out, it's helpful to have that kind of extra bit of motivation, because I think most comedians start out and they've got another job, they have a job, and this is just something they're doing on the side, and they can kind of take it or leave it at any moment. And in those circumstances, I found it quite helpful to have a little extra edge to kind of motivate an extra bit of writing or an extra bit of performing. But now, like, money and just sort of generally needing something to do is enough motivation to make stuff. I don't know how helpful it is to also feel the need to be the best comedian of all time. Some people I know kind of get a kick out of that, or get kind of a drive from needing to become that Jimmy Carrs of the world. And I don't think I have that, but I think that's fine. I think most people don't, and they, can still be very, very successful and make really good stuff, and not have to be sort of top dog. It doesn't have to work like that. And I hope that once this year is done, I'll be able to feel that in my bones, because right now there is quite a lot of competition, and it doesn't feel helpful. So
yeah,
we'll see how it shakes, I guess.
What about other kinds of targets, like wanting to appear on a particular stage or on a bill with a certain other comic? Do you set those kinds of objectives?
I do. I think that's a healthier way of doing it. I think is to feel like, okay, am I better than I was a year ago? And then kind of measuring yourself against that is much easier to do, first of all, because what we see of other kind of what anyone sees of other people in their position, I think, is often only the best of that. And so it's easy to feel like you're lagging behind, or you're not doing enough, or it's never going to work, that kind of thing. But if you can kind of sit down with yourself and say, oh, well, actually, if I compare myself to last year, I've done this and this, and I've got this in the diary, and I'm working my way towards this success or what have you. Then that's great, and that's helpful, and can only ever be kind of positive and motivating. I definitely have, certainly with every kind of club, it's easy to kind of know where you are, whether you feel like you're making progress, with the kind of the spots that you get, that kind of thing. Very easy to kind of measure yourself against last year, and like the kind of comedians that you're alongside. I've been able to gig with some comedy legends, which has been really lovely and felt very validating. Yeah, it's more productive than becoming the best comedian in the world. Undisputed heavyweight comedian is not. Firstly, it's not possible to ever satisfy the need to be the best single thing ever. But also, it's not gonna give you anything once you achieve that, if you ever can. So yeah, just satisfied with being a little bit better off than you were, I think, is all I need.
What about your own inspirations, people who are paving that path that you said about earlier on? Do you have people who particularly inspired you early on, or people who still inspire you?
Yeah, I see. It's really nice. I feel like there's a genre of comedy, which is like comedians who, because we see so much comedy that it takes a lot more to make us laugh, which is a shame in a way. I feel like we've maxed out our ability to laugh at things that we've seen before. But they turn up and do it in a completely different way, or just take you, you think it's going to go one way, or the audience thinks it's going to go one way, you think it's going to go a different way, and then it goes a whole third way that you didn't see coming. That's really wonderful. So like your Sam Campbells of the world, I just find hilarious. And again, I don't want to compare myself to other comedians more than is absolutely necessary, but like I do wish I had a little bit of whatever madness that is. It's just brilliant. So people like that, it's like more alternative comedy, I love. When I was growing up, it was Stuart Lee. I mean, still Stuart Lee, like he's still just an absolute. I'm sure this is not the first time that Stuart Lee has been mentioned, but he's really great. And when I was about sort of 16, 17, I first found clips of him, and that was very, very influential, I think. I mean, I'm not sure you would watch me and go, oh, that's exactly like Stuart Lee does, but trans. That's not what my act is at all. But just that little kind of glimpse of playing with an audience in a way that you're not quite sure how much of it is him and how much of it is his character, or whether there is really a character, or he really is just kind of airing the worst of himself on stage. That kind of playfulness and those kind of extended poetic bits where it's not funny until it is. Those are just really, really wonderful, and definitely a big kind of inspiration and influence. There's always comedy out there. That's the thing, is even if you think you've seen it all, I promise you there's something out there that will still take you by surprise, and that's what makes it such a wonderful medium. I think with other things, it's easy to feel like you've run out, I think, whereas comedy, I think it's genuinely impossible to ever do that. Like even now when I go and see comedians who are like either very new or kind of unheralded in some way, like there will still be things in there where I think that's really good, that's so good, I wish I'd thought of that. So yeah, it's I'm a big fan of comedy. I don't know if comedy needs to be pushed kind of conceptually on this podcast, but comedy's great, guys. You should really check it out.
There's a point that you raised there, which again is something I always ask about, is when you watch comedy, first of all, in and of itself, you just said that you love comedy. Is how much comedy you're able to still enjoy. And if you're able to enjoy it as an audience member might, because you're constantly analyzing it and sort of trying to predict what happens next. I mean, can you turn off that comedian mindset? Can you enjoy comedy, or does being within the industry jade it in some way and take the joy out of it?
It definitely does jade it, which sucks. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily being in the industry. I think it's just watching a lot of it.
Mm.
You will kind of recognize patterns and structures and feel like you can predict more where things are going. Like I was talking to someone over the weekend, another comedian who'd been to see Peter Kay, his new sort of arena tour.
Mm.
And he said that Peter Kay came out and the first thing he did was this thing, like this song with a shovel. And he turned to his friend and he said, the end of this show is going to be that, but like big and like a big rock song. And his friend was like, there's no way you can know that. There's no way you can know where that's going. And then that is exactly how it ended. So like, it does take some of the joy out of it. It's much harder to be surprised. And I think that's what a lot of comedy is that kind of vault fast where something that seemed to be one way is actually another. Just that, 4 times a minute for an hour is basically most comedy shows. So the more you've seen, the more likely you are to be able to predict where things are going to go. And it's very hard to stop analyzing it while it's happening, because that's what it means to listen to what someone's saying. I think it's very hard to stop, to kind of fully turn off that part of your brain. So it does jade it a little bit. I watched Inside Out 2 over the weekend, and this is sort of what that film is about, where I think there's something about growing up or just kind of maturing in any way where you feel like you experience less joy and there's other emotions that take over. And not to get too down, very happy, funny, come see the show. It's great. But there is an element of feeling like, the more you see, the more you experience, the less new experiences there are left. But the thing about comedy is that, as I say, there's always something you haven't seen. There's always something that will surprise you. And even if those moments are slightly fewer and further between, I don't think you can ever run out. You can never be as smart as every other comedian combined, much as some comedians believe that they are. Someone will always have something to be able to really tickle you. And so just, it's about going out and finding it and expecting it to come rather than, expecting it to never come. That sounded more profound, I think, than it really was. I think just go watch it and enjoy it. Just do your best and don't worry if it doesn't feel like immediately gratifying. There'll be stuff. There's always stuff. Don't worry, it's gonna be fine.
I'm reminded, because you mentioned Stuart Lee, it's just reminded me in that moment that I remember seeing once Lloyd Langford, I think, performing at the Banshee Labyrinth, and Stuart Lee popped in on the back row, just sort of beside me, watching the show, and I could just hear him chuckling away, just enjoying it. And that's the only thing I remember about that show, because it's so, I mean, it was obviously a great show, but what I remember most about, this is years ago now, but I remember most about it was the fact that this great comedian was laughing at another comedian, because I don't hear that very often, because it's always, oh, that's a good joke, or that's clever, but just not laughing out loud. You just don't hear it that much,
Yeah, that's really nice. I think there's some comedians who are much better at making other comedians laugh than kind of your average. So like Mark Silcox, I'm sure will be aware, is a bit of a kind of comedy legend, but only in comedy circles, where he'll just say things that are actually just normal sentences that a human being is allowed to say, but a comedian would never say. But because he's saying them as a comedian, they're just imbued with some kind of magic. And I just think he's hilarious. So it's like, I mean, we can never run out of things to say when Mark Silcox can come and do a lecture about eggs. And he's just talking about eggs. He's just like, would you like some chickpeas? And he gives you some chickpeas. There's no kind of double meaning. There's no extra layer of anything, but there's just that kind of magic to it that I think Stuart Lee would, stand at the back of the room and chuckle at. Where it's just, you can never run out of that kind of stuff. It still hits just the same. So yeah, I think that's why comedians tend to kind of gravitate towards that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, we've teased a little about your upcoming debut, so why don't you tell me what's the show called? What's it all about? What can we expect?
Sure. So the show is called Dead Name. It's on at Peasants Courtyard, 4:30 p.m. All through the Edinburgh Fringe, and it is about coming out. It's about sort of realizing I was trans, and then kind of figuring out a way to say goodbye to the person that I used to be. Because it is very much about changing literally everything about your life all at once. Something that I found a lot easier to deal with than the people around me did, because they were very much surprised by this whole notion. So it's about trying to say goodbye and about trying to reconcile kind of who I am if I used to be this whole person that I'm not anymore. But also, crucially, it's very funny. It's got lots of jokes in it, even though it is about kind of the fragile nature of the self and how hard it is to be LGBTQ plus in these trying times. As well as that, it's also very funny, and I'm very excited. It's as you say, my debut show, so it feels like a very kind of personal, outpouring into the world of my sort of essence, but not in a weird way that you guys are gonna love. Yeah, it's I'm excited. It should be good.
Yeah. When you go about putting a show together like your first hour, do you lead with the jokes, or do you feel like you have a story to tell that's more important than the jokes fit around the story?
Well, hard to say what comes first. It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation.
Yeah.
Although the egg did very much come first, so it's even more hard, even more difficult to figure out, even more intractable than that question. I think to some extent the story comes first because the story is things that happened to me, and then I thought about the jokes later. So, but also, I've been writing these jokes for the last kind of 3 years since I came out. And as I say, I have had a slightly codependent relationship between me coming out and me writing comedy about coming out. So they do very much kind of go hand in hand. I sort of understand myself as a human being, at least in part through the lens of a comedian. Like that is quite intrinsic to my nature. So, it's hard to say which is kind of the originator. The jokes. So, I mean, because these are the things that were on my mind, because they were the things that were happening to me, those are the things that I wrote jokes about. And because I was writing jokes about them, I was saying them, and they were then impacting the person that I felt like I was becoming. Really, this is what the show should be about, because this is a whole kind of hall of mirrors of comedic self. And yeah, the jokes are about the things that were happening in my life, and the things that were happening in my life were also very funny. It's both and it's neither, and it's all, and it's great. It's going to be great.
And as we mentioned, this isn't your first time at the Fringe. So what's your Fringe experience as a whole, like the social aspect, the industry aspect, the comedic aspect?
Yeah, I've loved the Fringe. Whenever I've had the chance to go, as you said, I did a split bill last year, so just 30 minutes of me and 30 minutes of another comedian, Katie Green. Shout out Katie Green. Go see her show. It's also very funny. This is, I think, my sixth Fringe in some capacity, like either as a punter or as a purveyor of poor university sketch comedy. I've always really loved it. It's just such an exciting place to be. It is very expensive, and that has definitely changed the face of it in the time that I've been there. Just people who would otherwise have come for 2 days are just not bothering, which means that your audiences are different. Audiences are, it's harder to fill rooms. So there are these associated with stresses with the Fringe, but overall, it is still very much kind of the arts thing in the world, and that is, I think, incredibly valuable, and it's just such a fun place to be. I mean, it's where I met loads of comedians for the first time who I've since become really good friends with. It's where I have had loads of comedic experiences that I never would have had otherwise. I've seen the best comedy I've ever seen there. I've met some industry people, some of whom are really nice and some of whom are not. But, you know, that's life. It's in some ways the best and the worst place for a comedian to be. So I'm very excited because that's what life's all about.
Yeah. Do you think that so far there's one lesson that you've learned that sort of informs your philosophy going forward? Is there one overriding piece of information that you would impart?
I think someone said to me recently, they said they've been up to the Fringe for I think like 10 years, and last year was the first time that they just performed comedy to the audience that was in the room, which sounds very simple, and it is, but I think that is really sort of the point, is that it's not about necessarily, I think it's only about creating art or doing all these cool, interesting things. It's only about that sort of one step removed from the thing that it actually is. I think if you go about it trying to make something meaningful and transcendent, and that's your kind of primary or only priority, then I think you miss the wood for the trees. That really what it is it's about making a room full of people laugh.
Yeah.
And it is very easy to lose sight of that, particularly in the kind of debut show or like, you know, any kind of solo show, feeling like, oh, you have to have this whole grand narrative and you have to do this, you have to tick this box, blah blah blah. It's easy to forget that you are just going in there in a room, shutting the door, and you're alone with these people for an hour, and your job is to make them laugh as much as you can.
Yeah.
So that's, you know, it's a work in progress, I think, to make that, to really kind of internalize that lesson. I think it takes a very long time to really truly grasp that, but I'm doing my best. Definitely very good advice.
So what so far then do you think have been your best and worst experiences in comedy?
Oh, that's a good question. Best experience, I did a gig in Reading, which is not how most great comedy experiences start. I did a gig in Reading at the Reading Hexagon for the Slapstick Festival,
Yes.
which is like a comedy festival.
The big comedy bash.
So this was, yes, and it was in front of like 800 people or something, which is still among the biggest crowds I've ever done comedy to. And the lineup was just stacked. Like Arthur Smith was there. Who was hosting? Rob Brydon was hosting.
Yeah.
Just loads of people
Yep.
who were really, really great. And I went on and I did, I think 10, and I felt like I smashed it. And my parents were there, my family were there, and it just felt like, okay, I've arrived, kind of thing. Obviously, it hasn't really made any tangible difference to my life or career, but it felt like a moment, at least for me, where I could be like, okay, I can absolutely, you know, more than hold my own with these people that I've seen on TV since I was a little kid.
Yeah.
So that was pretty special. Hard to top that, I think. And then worst moment, I did a gig. Did a gig in an army barracks. This was back before I came out, actually. It was maybe my third gig. Don't know why it was in an army barracks. Don't know who decided this was a good idea. I was still a university student. I was down in Exeter, where I was doing my master's degree. And the gig was organized by just like this comedy society guy. And we all went down. We had to bring our passports with us to get into this army base. We were doing a gig for like the junior officer corps of like 20-year-old, 21-year-old, you know, people who joined the army aged 18 wanting to become a general. So people who were quite serious. And then, so that was the core of the audience. And then in the background, you had just like standing with their arms folded colonels who were not easily amused, especially in front of their, you know, inferiors. So I thought it'd be a really good idea to do my Brexit material about how stupid all the people who voted for Brexit are. But the joke is that I play with that, and it's like, it's not really what I'm saying, but it is what I'm saying, but it's not really. And I think those kind of fine, delicate comedic points were actually lost on this particular crowd. I don't think they were very excited to hear that I was basically calling them all a bunch of dickheads. They also had a lot of guns. And after my set was over, bombed, just in case that wasn't clear, bombed hard. And then I had to run to my car to drive out of this army base because I was genuinely worried that they were going to beat me up. I didn't get beaten up, but I think there's a pretty reasonable chance that if I had stuck around, then that would have happened. So that was a short, sharp shock of an early lesson in comedy, which is play the audience as it's dealt and don't try and make kind of transcendental art. Just make them laugh and then get out of there. So that is it's a very valuable lesson that I've tried to hold on to ever since.
So where can we find out about you and where we can come and see you performing?
You can find out about me on social media. I am at Dee_Allum on all social media platforms, where you'll find a link to my link tree with all my dates and things. At the moment, it's the Fringe and a handful of previews beforehand, and then after that, if you're still interested, then I'm sure things will be updated on the link tree in due course.
And so my final question then, Dee, how would you sum up comedy in a nutshell?
Comedy is, in a nutshell, the best thing that's ever happened to me. It's so magical, and I don't think there's anything else like it in terms of how it makes me feel. So it's very, very special to me, and I think it's got something for everyone. It's changed my life and will continue to do so, I'm sure, in the next 30 years. And I'm very grateful to it for all that it's given me, and long may that continue. I imagine that's a slightly more soppy answer than you usually get, but it's true. It's all true.
Dee, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the time with you. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.